On the heels of these events, in Massachusetts, militias mobilized throughout the colonies, and delegates from the 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. In May of 1775, the Continental Congress met again. Within months, Georgia joined the Congress, and Congress organized an army, commanded by George Washington. It issued $2 million in bills of credit. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin also played important roles. The Congress reached out to other British colonies, including Canada and the Caribbean islands, and to Spain for support, but the results were varied. An unsuccessful effort to take Canada ended in the spring of 1776. By March, the British had been forced out of Boston. British efforts in the South had also failed. Hopes of reconciliation waned. In a brilliant pamphlet, Thomas Paine helped to cut Americans' emotional ties to Britain and the King. And by July 1776, Congress was ready to take that final step. It approved Thomas Jefferson's revised draft of the Declaration of Independence, with no dissenting votes. New York abstained from voting. Men of wealth and position committed treason against the government of England by signing a document that pledged them to the principle of equality. The Second Continental Congress commenced on May 10th, 1775. The committees of observation and safety, which had been formed by the different colonial in response to having their colonial legislatures closed by governors, chose delegates and sent them off to this Congress. Some of the most notable delegates of this time were Thomas Jefferson, who was at this point a new delegate, and George Washington, who decided to show up in uniform and spent the rest of the Congress in his military uniform. He was probably hoping that he would get the job of leading the armed forces. So this Congress resolved that the colonies were now in a state of defense against the British government or the British troops. And so the colonies decided to create a militia, because they didn't have the money to create a actual standing army, and they decided that George Washington would be the commander. He was elected unanimously, and he also decided to serve without any salary. This created the Continental Army, which was going to help out the militiamen in Massachusetts who were already experiencing conflict with the British soldiers. The Congress also voted to give $2 million in to support the army in its endeavor to, or this newly formed military militia, in its efforts to kick out the British soldiers from Massachusetts and North America. However, also during this time, some of the delegates were very hesitant about such aggressive measures, and they wanted to create something called the Olive Branch Petition, which was a petition to King George asking him to prevent any more hostilities by changing his mind about the issues. It was written by one of the delegates named John Dickinson. However, John Dickinson also was involved with Thomas Jefferson in creating a document called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, which was basically a restatement of the reasons why they were taking up arms against the British government. They quoted that they would rather die freemen than live as slaves. It was during this time that they also appointed a commissioner to negotiate with the Indians to keep them out of the conflict. And they reinstated Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster General in order to keep the mail moving and communication between the colonies consistent. Well, in Canada, the Congress first invited Canada to join them in their struggle against the British government for their, quote, common liberty. The Quebec Canadians failed to respond positively or immediate. immediately. So the Congress then reversed its idea and authorized a military expedition to try to eliminate Quebec as a threat to their cause for independence. This set up basically the eventual reality that Canada would be its own country and United States would be its own country. The island colonies of Barbados, Jamaica, and Grenada were also contacted by the colonists, and they really approved of the colonial endeavor to try to gain freedom or independence from the British government. But the colonies in the islands were heavily dependent on the British Navy to maintain their control over the slave populations, so they were unable to go along with the Americans at this point. And Nova Scotia, which is up here, was also tempted to join the colonists in their endeavor towards independence, but there was a fort that was built here in Halifax, and that kept Nova Scotia from joining the rest of the colonies. Spain was the most interesting addition to the colonial fight for independence, because the British Navy was so good at creating a blockade along the coastline that the colonists were finding it very difficult to gain the supplies that they needed in order to fight this war of independence. So they sent representatives down the Mississippi River, down all the way to New Orleans, which was at this point owned by Spain, and they approached Spain and asked Spain if they could begin trade up through this area and over the Appalachian Mountains into the colonies, and so provide for their troops and the populations there. And Spain realized the difficulties that this could cause. Number one, it could create problems with Spain's colonies, because it would cause a desire for revolution and change from a monarchical system into a republican system, and that would not be appropriate for Spanish colonies. But it was also a danger for Spain's empire then, as a result of those revolutions that could happen in Spain's colonies. So they were very hesitant to support the Americans, but on the other hand, they would have loved to see the British suffer, because the British had recently defeated the Spanish and had taken away parts of Florida, East Florida and West Florida, away from Spain. And so the Spanish were very happy to see that Britain was now experiencing difficulties with their own colonies. So in the end, Spain decided to support the colonists and to start sending up supplies up the Mississippi River and along the Ohio River all the way into the central and northern colonies in order to provide for those troops. Ethan Allen, who was from Vermont, led a small force into New York and attacked a fort named Ticonderoga. And he was successful, and he demanded that the fort commander open up in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, which the British commander surrendered to. This was really surprising to the new Congress, because it had not commissioned this attack, and it was done in its own name, and it was done by New Englanders, or men from Vermont, in the territory of New York, and this was a bit problematic. So it foreshadowed some of the problems that the colonies would have in interacting with one another. But it was successful, and they were able to use the arms that were captured in later conflicts. The Americans actually transported a lot of the fort's cannon to be used in the siege of Boston, That was a very tricky business because it was over a lot of muddy ground and mountains, and so it was quite a feat, actually. Boston, at this point, was occupied by British soldiers. They had been joined by reinforcements, and they now numbered about 6,500 or more. And the American forces were outside the city, laying siege to it, and the Americans probably had about 10,000 men at this point. Washington, who was the leader of these troops, took a position on the Charleston Peninsula, which was north of the city of Boston. Washington's troops took a position on the Charleston Peninsula that was right above Boston, the city of Boston. And they used the cannons that they had captured in the Battle of Ticonderoga and to basically patrol the harbor that was part of the Boston Harbor, and also to bombard the battlements that the British had erected over there. And General Gage chose a frontal attack, so he put his troops all across on this side right here, and used a frontal attack, fighting up this hill, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill over here. The battle was named after this hill up here rather than this one, even though there were actually two hills. And Gage's idea of just marching straight up the hill was like suicide. He lost about 1,000 men. Probably about 220 men were actually killed, but many more than that were wounded. And there were about 1,500 American, over here, American troops that were lined up, and they were sharpshooters, and they were just picking them off like they were sitting ducks. So the Americans eventually, they lost about 140 men and that were killed, and about 440 that were wounded. But eventually the Americans had to retreat because they ran out of gunpowder. And so even though the British maintained the territory, it's considered an American victory because of the just the great number of casualties that the British experienced in this battle. Also in 1775, June of 1775, the Congress sent an expeditionary force to try to capture Canada. They sent General Richard Montgomery up to Montreal, where he was successful in capturing that city. And then another young general named Benedict Arnold led troops to join with Montgomery in attack of Quebec. They had, in the 6 Years' War, or the 7 Years' War, they had attacked Quebec before and had been successful. However, during that time, the British had been busy building fortifications, and so it was a lot more difficult to take Quebec this time around. Montgomery was killed, and about 100 Americans were also killed, and 300 of them were taken prisoner. Benedict Arnold was held in prison as well for quite a while during the Revolutionary War. The Americans that were laying siege to Quebec were eventually had to retreat because of a British reinforcement that was sent down the St. Lawrence River to help relieve the British troops in Quebec. So it was in the spring that they had to retreat back to the New England states. Back in Boston, Washington had put up cannon on the southern side of the Boston city, where he could shoot cannon fire into the harbor and into the city, and to harry the British troops that were still stationed in the city of Boston. Eventually, the British had to evacuate the city because they couldn't take the fire, and they evacuated back up to Halifax, which is up here, which was a British stronghold. They took with them about 1,000 loyalists who decided to go with the troops rather than stay with the rebel colonists. And down in Virginia, the royal governor Dunmore had unwisely promised the slaves their freedom if they would rise up against their masters and fight on the side of the British. This was the planters' worst fears, and they realized that the British government was not going to fight for their rights, and so they joined the rebel cause at that point as well. Dunmore was forced to retreat from Norfolk to his ships that were just off the coast, and from there he gave a retaliation fire on the city of Norfolk and damaged a lot on January 1st, 1776. All right, and now we turn to no turning back. So the Second Continental Congress reconvened in September of 1775, and at this point they created the American Navy, and they authorized privateers to go and target British Navy or British shipping, and to start collecting an American Navy by recommissioned British ships. They also contacted other European powers to send out feelers to see if they could gain some support from other European powers, especially from France. And of course, France was very open to the idea. It wanted to pick up trading opportunities in the American colonies, and it also wanted to diminish British powers and to help by helping to supply the rebels. Thomas Paine also at this point wrote a very influential pamphlet called Common Sense. It was published in early 1776, and it became an instant bestseller. It was very, very effective. It sold over 100,000 copies within the first few months. Some of the main ideas were that the British colonial policies were basically inconsistent, and so the only course for the American colonies was independence. Nowhere in the physical universe did a smaller heavenly body control a larger one, and so why should tiny England control such a huge North America? Thirdly, the king was nothing more than a royal brute of Great Britain. And fourthly, America had a sacred mission, moral obligation to the world to set up an independent and democratic republic, untainted by the association of corrupting monarchical Great Britain. This document helped to persuade the public, and it was also very, very influential in persuading the Congress to go all the way in declaring independence from Great Britain. There were a few other things, though, that also influenced Congress's decision to announce its independence. Number one, it really could not expect to gain any aid from France unless it had declared independence. France was not interested in joining against Great Britain unless the colonies were serious about their desire for independence. At this point also, the colonists received news that the British were recruiting German mercenaries called Hessians to come over and fight against the colonists. And they were shocked that the British government would use Germans against their own, what they still were their own countrymen. This was a rude awakening to the attitudes that the Parliament had towards the colonists. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee proposed independence in Congress. He said, "These united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states." This motion was adopted on July 2nd of 1776. But they still needed a formal document to show to other nations that they were indeed free, or had at least declared freedom from the British government. So the Congress appointed a committee of independents to prepare a statement, and they appointed Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to that committee. There was some debate and a few amendments before they adopted the actual document. But they, especially any anti-slavery rhetoric that was added in by Thomas Jefferson, which is a little bit ironic since he owned his own slaves. But Jefferson had blamed England for continuing the slave trade in the colonies despite colonial wishes, and Southerners also were not in favor of abolishing slavery because it's what their whole livelihood was based upon. The Declaration did not address the Parliament, but it did address the King, saying that the King was the one who was in the end responsible for all of these problems that the colonies were facing. The date for the discussion about this document was on July 1st, and a large majority of the states were in favor of it, but the final vote was not taken until July 2nd, and 12 colonies voted in favor of it, and there were no votes against it because New York abstained from voting. So the Declaration of Independence was formally approved on July 2nd of 1776, but it wasn't actually proclaimed to the rest of the United States until July 4th. The Declaration of Independence has three major parts. The first is the preamble, and it's heavily influenced by John Locke. This preamble states that the colonies have a right to break away if their natural rights are violated, and these natural rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is, or property, as some people wanted to put in the Declaration. And it also stated that all men are created equal. The second part of the Declaration of Independence is a list of 27 grievances that the colonies had against King George. These underwent the most changes in the editing process, but they have ended up having, then they charged the king with imposing taxes without the colony's consent, eliminating trial by jury, military dictatorship, maintaining the standing armies during peacetime, cutting off trade, burning towns, hiring mercenaries, and inciting American violence. So it's all the British fault for the Americans having creating violence. Then finally, the last part of the Declaration of Independence is the formal Declaration of Independence. And this statement broke the ties with England. It stated that the United States, officially an independent country, and it was signed by each representative at the Congress. The result of this was that foreign aid could now be given, or at least solicited from other countries. All right, and the Declaration of Independence, which is something we have been memorizing, you should be able to say this with me. So, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect for the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you're planning to have some extra credit, you will continue with me. That they are, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizations, its powers in such forms, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments, long established, should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, nay, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And follows a long list of 27 grievances against King George. But this was a document that was created probably to be performed rather than simply read to yourself. So it's good for you to memorize this speech and to be able to at least tell me the first paragraph.